Okay, great. So welcome everybody and welcome to how to review your website for accessibility improvements. My name is Michaela Lederman and I'm the Senior Accessibility and QA Lead. I am also a certified web accessibility specialist through the International Association of Accessibility Professionals. And today we will be going over how to perform your own accessibility reviews. You may not leave here a full expert, but you will leave this presentation with a basic understanding of how to catch some of the more common errors that we tend to find. But before we really dive in, I wanted to jump into this first because it's usually the first question that I get when I do this as a workshop or a presentation. And it's, what about accessibility plugins and overlays? Why do I need to learn how to do an accessibility review when I can just buy this overlay? So before we really dive in, I wanted to jump in and go over this briefly. So if you're unfamiliar with these widgets and overlays, it would be something like this. You can see here in the bottom right-hand corner, there's a little red arrow pointing to this little button, a blue button with a person on it. Now, if we were to click on that button there, this whole widget pops up. So it gives you all of these options to make these accessibility adjustments on a site. So you can see there's seizure safe profile, maybe an ADH friendly profile. You can use their screen reader. You can change their font and a ton of options. This gives you more options than any person will really ever need to adjust their own website to best fit their needs. It doesn't require anyone going into their code and fixing anything. That it will just be JavaScript and it fixes everything on your site so that it's compliant. Sounds pretty amazing, right? Well, I feel like we've all learned this the hard way in the past. If it sounds too good to be true, it most likely is. And in this case, it is. I know it probably has the right intentions or you have the right intentions for using it. And people are just scared about getting sued, but implementing a process, getting a review, and implementing changes to improve your site can happen a little bit at a time. Don't fall for all of these get accessible quick schemes. This is something we could go into a lot of detail about, but we have a lot to go through today. So it looks like you'll just have to come back for a possible future webinar on overlays in general. But anyway, the gist of all of this is that there are a number of issues with accessibility plugins, such as that a majority of the guidelines in WCAG cannot be fixed or detected with automated tools alone. We just don't have that type of ability with any kind of artificial intelligence quite yet. And screen reader users will always use their own proprietary software. Anyone that requires assistive technology will use what they are used to, what they have learned, what they've spent all their money and time and effort learning and interacting with. They're not going to use this little screen reader or keyboard option that they have the ability to use with these plugins. And you need to customize your experience before you can even interact with the site. This could take, yes, it could take seconds, but it could take minutes. It's taking out valuable time out of the person's usage there. And really, you just want someone to be able to interact with your site right away. These also require JavaScript to work properly. And a lot of people who require assistive technology to navigate a site may actually turn off JavaScript completely. So if the JavaScript is turned off, this no longer works. So that's something you definitely need to take a note of. And every plugin is different and therefore includes a new learning curve. There are so many of these plugins out there nowadays. So if you're using one and you're on a website and you have it set up exactly how you want, but then you go to a new site and there's a different one, everything's in a different order. You have to kind of figure out where it is, what's going on. It can deter the user's experience overall. And it takes focus away from screen readers if it's the first thing on the page. And it gives you too many options and customizations. Yes, it's kind of fun to go in there and change the font and see what's going on from an able person view. However, for those that actually require these things, it may actually be deterring altogether. Think about if you go to a restaurant that has way too many options on their menu. A lot of times I just default to chicken fingers because I can't think of anything else because there's too many options to choose from. This is an issue for those who may have some cognitive impairments that may deter them from choosing the right decision because there are too many options and customizations. And this one might be a little bit of a stretch, but the cost for a monthly subscription can eventually be more expensive than just a true revamp, especially since you don't have to do everything all at once from a revamp status. And in 2021, over 400 lawsuits were filed against companies using widgets and overlays, stating that these solutions do nothing to make websites more accessible for the blind. Feel free to check out this whole report from UsableNet's 2021 ADA digital accessibility lawsuit. But more importantly, we partner with the Blind Institute of Technology for screen reader testing here at Aten, and we have had lengthy discussions with their team. My favorite quote from all of this is from an actual screen reader user, is that website overlays hijack the user experience, attempting to display the site in a way it thinks is helpful to me. Many overlays sit at the top of the page and continuously send audio announcements to the screen reader, asking the user to engage the tool. These alerts constantly interrupt the audio when the web page is being read. And you can imagine that that constant interruption of audio is going to be very disrupting for someone who is navigating solely by audio in general. So as you can see, it's actually creating more harm than good. It may deter some lawyers for now, but it doesn't actually change the structure of your site. And if the code actually hasn't changed, then your site is still inaccessible, unfortunately. And so we can see from Mike here that overlays trick product teams into thinking accessibility can be solved and put out of mind with just a few clicks. There is no substitute for making digital accessibility an embedded part of your team culture. And that is why we're here today. So let's dive in and talk about some of the steps we can take to make your site more accessible. So first, we just want to focus on setting up a complete review on your end. Now, this isn't completely foolproof, as I mentioned before. You aren't going to leave here as a true accessibility expert. However, these include some extremely basic steps absolutely anyone can take to start making improvements on their site. A reminder that full VPATs and accessibility reports should be done by a true expert in the field. But taking these steps prior to the review could save your organization time and money in that process. So first, let's start setting up for your review, and feel free to, if you have two screens, to start doing this on your end as well. These are like, you can do this in real time, and you might have more questions at the end regarding that as well. So all of these pages that we're going to gather here may not be relevant to you, but these are the types of things that I would be looking for when I'm starting an audit. I like to look at the analytics and take a look at the 10 most visited pages. Obviously, if this is a large site, then maybe I'll look at the 20 most visited pages and so on. But by finding out the pages that people are frequenting, we can make sure that those are the most important ones to make sure that those are accessible. We, of course, want to look at your homepage. We want to make sure that is the face of your organization. We need to make sure that your homepage is fully accessible. If you have content that's behind a login, you need to make sure that your login page is accessible. Can a user actually log into the site in order to gain more of that information? So that's a very important one. Look at your navigation. Any of those main landing pages are going to be very important. A lot of people are most likely navigating to those pages often because they are the main landing pages. If you have any form on your site, you should be reviewing that. So that could be as simple as maybe just a search form. It could be something that maybe you have a lot of content on your page and you want to filter that content to get more information. Those checkboxes and radio buttons and so on are going to be important as well. Or you may have a full contact form. But of course, if you have any form elements, those are things you definitely want to take a look at. If you have any pages on your site with known tables, definitely we want to take a look at those and do some testing with that. Infographics and images, as well as various types of charts and graphs, are going to be very important. You need to make sure that you're giving the correct information for all users to understand what's happening in that infographic or what's happening in that chart, in that graph, or if we need to give alternative information so the user can maybe navigate that via a table or a list or something of that sort. And basically all major interactive elements on your page, on your website. If you can interact with it with a mouse, you need to make sure that it's going to be accessible. You're going to be able to use it via keyboard. It's usable via screen reader and so on. So just if you find anything, it could be an interactive map, or it could just be as simple as maybe an accordion item. You just want to make sure that any of those are taken care of. So as you can see here, this is just an overview of what a basic setup is for when I start an audit. So this one obviously has some content already in there. I've changed the URLs, which I got rid of those URLs. I changed a lot of the names there, but the overall lighthouse, errors, contrast, and alerts are accurate, and the content types and the elements are accurate there. This lists all the pages that I'm going to be reviewing. So I always have this first page in, let's say, a Google Doc like we have, or a Google Sheet like we have here. That's kind of an easy way to do it. So this one is just for the overviews of the pages. So I have each page listed. I've included the content type, so like the type of page that it is. So you can see a page from the footer nav, a page from the main nav, something from analytics, like where I'm getting that information from. I've also included the element that that's the reason why I'm looking at it. So you can see there's tables on a couple of these. There's charts and graphs on some of these. Some are just regular old content, but I at least know that, okay, I need to look at the table on this page, if anything. You'll also see columns E through H are going to be related to automated testing, and we'll be going over those in a moment. But I like to have these beginning scores and the beginning numbers here so that once we do make those implementations, we can kind of come back to this and see if we've had any kind of improvements. I also, of course, have some notes that are probably not relevant, but usually it's just for me to understand, okay, here's what's going on, or maybe it's kind of like you need to look at this one in more depth later on. But overall, this would be the basic setup of what I'd be working with. So next, now that we have all the pages that we're looking for, we want to record all of our findings. So that one that I just showed you was the listing of all the pages and just that overview finding. Here, we're going to go into more detail about how we are going to record all these findings that we're going to be doing in a minute. So of course, we want the URLs so that we can make sure we can always go back and test it. We need to include if it's an error or a warning. Now, these will be given to you if it's an error or warning via automated testing. However, when we get to the manual testing, if you don't know the difference between an error or warning, that's totally fine. Just as long as you have that kind of notice, or maybe if it looks like really bad, maybe consider an error, or maybe just ignore that part altogether if you need to. I always like to include the WCAG issue that is not working with. So sometimes I'm not going to be including like, oh, well, this is going against 3.1.12 issue, because that's not really human readable. If I'm giving that to a client, they're not going to understand what I'm talking about. So I try to put into a human readable format. So meaning that, okay, if the contrast is not correct, all I'm writing is that it's a contrast error, or maybe it's missing a label or anything like that. I try to just at least do a quick outline of what the actual issue is. I'd like to include the location of where the issue is happening. So maybe it's just in the header, maybe it's just in the footer, maybe it's in the sidebar, maybe it's in a staff image or something like that, as long as I know exactly what I'm pinpointing on the page. Any details relevant to the issue at hand. Something that we do at Aten is I like to include who needs to actually fix that issue, because a lot of times I actually see that content creators need to make those updates, and it's not even on the dev or the designer to create those. So that's an important one that we need to focus on. And then, of course, if you happen to know the solution, we will include the solution. But if you don't know the solution, of course, that's fine. As long as you have what the error is, where it's happening, that makes it at least a little bit easier to kind of find that solution in the future. And then if you want to, I like to include the type of test. So of course, Wave and Lighthouse is the automated ones that we're going to go over. And that way, if someone wants to replicate it and see if that issue is still there, they can run these tests and see if that's still happening. So looking quickly at an example of all the issues that I found. So you can see here, I went through and I have the page name, the type of issue, the WCAG issue at hand, details on the issue, notes, and the team member. You can see here, I even have elements in the first column that are listed as site-wide elements. And that's just something that I'm seeing as an issue throughout the entire site. So for instance, in the header or the footer. So most likely fixing that will fix it everywhere on the site. The type you can see here is keyboard, visual, there's a screen reader. That's where I would also write automated testing, Wave, Lighthouse. I have the error, I have the WCAG issue going on there, details on the issue that's needed, some notes, as well as the team member. Here are just developer ones. I like to put the content creator ones in a different tab so that when we send it over to the client, they can just have one thing to look at rather than going through all of them and trying to find what's relevant to them. Okay, so we have a basic setup of what we're doing and kind of the goal of what it's all going to be looking like. So let's just dive into actually testing your site. First things first, run automated tests on all of the pages from your list. Now, when I talk about automated testing, I talk about these tools that comb through the code to find these nitty-gritty issues. A lot of these issues are things that would be difficult to find manually combing through the code or looking at the front end of the site. These are issues like insufficient contrast or incorrect heading structure, maybe some vague links, maybe missing form labels, and so on. These are things you would really only find if you do look at the code yourself. Keep in mind that some results from your automated testing will actually give you false errors. And that's because, yes, this does automated testing, but human logic will always need to be applied from an accessibility standpoint. And the common false errors that I tend to see are just related to contrast. There may be some other ones here or there, but really contrast is the one that you would have to realize that it could be a false error. And like I said before, automated testing is not a catch-all, and manual testing will always be necessary, but it's definitely the first step in the review process. So I would recommend 2 different programs for absolutely beginners, and especially for those that aren't ready to install anything or aren't ready to dive deep into the code. And that's Wave as well as Lighthouse. There are a number of automated tools you can integrate with your everyday CLI if you are more dev heavy. You can use things like Axe DevTools, Pally, Koali, and so on. But for today's session, we'll just be focusing on these easy to use, and they are free, tools for everyone. So anyone with or without a technical background can actually perform their reviews. So first one is wave.webaim.org. They have a website as well as an extension that you can add to Chrome or Firefox. I like the extension because it's good for testing things that are behind logins as well. It gives a fairly clean overview of what errors and warnings are found in the code. And I always recommend this one for people starting out because the site in general is great resources or has great resources for learning WCAG standards and the basics of just ADA compliance in general. And the information along with the errors is a bit more human readable than some of the other free review sites that I've seen. So I actually have a recording here, so I'll walk you through exactly what I'm finding from a Wave standpoint, and we can kind of see what's going on. So here we're on the Wave site, and if you scroll down, you can see there are some links to the extension, but this is the wave.webaim.org, and what you can do is you can put in a website that you're trying to review. So here we're going to look at the Apple site. It will refresh the page with the site that you're looking at, and as you can see here, there's kind of a lot going on in the page. There's a lot of tags, there's a lot of images, you don't really know what's happening. You can see errors, contrast errors, alerts, features, structural elements, and ARIA. For our sake, I always recommend for absolute beginners, just turn off the features, turn off structural elements, and turn off ARIA, because those are not going to be relevant to you. Just take a look at the alerts, errors, and contrast errors. Now, one thing you need to remember is that when you look at the error, you can click on that little information icon, and it will tell you a little bit more information about what's going on. We also have this code element down here. So if you were to click on one of the issues, it will take you exactly where it is in the code. You also have the ability to click on it in the actual area over here. So it will tell you what the issue is. You can jump to the code, you can jump to the reference and everything going on. You also have these other tabs here. So structure, for instance, is a good one where you can see maybe your heading structure. A lot of times you'll see some other things in there as well, but the heading structure is definitely one of the more important pieces there. And contrast is very important. This is where I see a lot of issues and people want to know how to fix it. So let's say we want to fix this one right here. So you can see we have this and we're failing on the AA standard, but we pass for AAA, or for large text anyway. So you can actually change the slider there until you can see that you're passing for normal text at AA, which is kind of the bare minimum of what we're looking for. You also have the ability to turn off the styles completely. And this is a great way to see how a screen reader user or assistive tech user may be seeing the site on their end. So you can see, is that table that you were looking at, is that an actual table or is it a list? Is a heading just bolded paragraph text, or is it an actual heading element? You can kind of see how that's all being addressed from a screen reader perspective, because again, they don't have styles. They're not paying attention to colors or underlines or anything like that. They're not getting that information. They're getting those bare minimum semantics. So that's a great one to start with, is definitely looking at the Wave tool. Next, I want to talk about Google Lighthouse. Lighthouse is found on Chrome in the developer tools. I recommend using something along with Lighthouse because Lighthouse is a slightly different algorithm than most others. Like, it's not going to give you the same exact errors as Wave, because obviously Google is trying to use it to weigh their search results more so than anything else. Of course, they want to make sure it's accessible, but they're just using what they can to weigh their search results. It also does more than just accessibility. You can do performance testing, best practices, and SEO. It's nice because it gives your site an overall score, which supposedly helps with the Google search results, like I said. And obviously a higher score is just meaning that it's a better search result for you. You may, if there's two, let's say there were two Aten design groups, which that's not the case, and one was ranked higher in the accessibility standpoint, that may help them rank higher in the Google search results in general. So let's take a look at Google Lighthouse and see how you can use it. So here you can see we're back on the Apple website. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click in a moment here, and then we're going to just go into inspect. And this will bring up the code in the inspect tool, and you can see all the tab options that we have. And we're going to choose Lighthouse. And here, like I mentioned, there are other options, other categories we can use, but we're going to stick with accessibility and desktop for this example. But you can change to mobile, you can change to obviously other ones, and we're going to generate this report. Now, after we generate it, obviously takes a moment. We need to see what's going on. It's going to give you that score. So Apple was rated at 84 when I did this recording. You can see it's giving you some of the issues that it's finding. And with that, it gives you more information about what that issue is. it gives you a screenshot of kind of where it is. And if you click on the code that's there, it will jump you right to that part in the HTML. So you know exactly what's happening there. And it will give you all these options, but it also tells you items that you need to manually check. So like I said, automated testing can only take you so far. However, of course, this is the first step, because if you get those things done, then you can at least cross that off your list and just have a focus on the manual testing to come. So next, we performed our automated testing. So we're going to move into manual testing. And this first part of manual testing is we're going to look at it through a keyboard. A number of users who are visual users may not actually be able to use a mouse. Or maybe there's someone like myself, an everyday user, who just finds it quicker to do some keyboard commands to browse rather than move their hand over to the mouse. If you're going to be like jumping through a form, you want to just like press tab over and over again to jump forward. Because of that, anyone can actually test their site using their keyboard and use that instead of a mouse, of course, to get where they need to go. The good thing is, if your keyboard can interact with an element, then a screen reader user or other assistive tech user can at least interact with that element as well. If your user cannot interact with it via keyboard, then the screen reader will also not be able to interact with it. There's obviously some things we're going to have to add from a screen reader perspective, but knowing that they can at least interact with it is bare minimum. Making sure your site works via keyboard is a major step. And just a note that some browsers actually require you to turn this on. So if you try to get into your website and you're on there, I know Safari, for instance, you have to turn it on. So if you're getting in there and you're pressing tab over and over again and trying to get into your site and it's not happening, just go to your browser preferences, and there is a section for accessibility, and you should be able to turn that on pretty easily. So let's jump into accessibility testing with keyboard. How do you navigate via keyboard? Well, basically, you'll be using these keys. You will be using the tab, shift, escape, spacebar, enter, and arrow keys. Keep in mind that keyboard users only tab to interactive elements and elements within their tab flow. You will not be tabbing to like headings or paragraphs or list elements unless they are also links or buttons, for instance. So don't be worried if you start tabbing through and you're like, why am I skipping over these major headings? You should not be interacting with them. You will only be gaining focus on things that you should be able to interact with. So first, and the most important one here is tab. This is how you just straightforward, just go straight through the site. So you just tab, 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 and it will jump to the next item, to the next item, to the next item that you have there. Well, let's say you wanted to go backwards because you accidentally went too far. You would use shift and tab together, and that will bring you back to the next or to the previous interactive element. So a lot of times you just hold down shift and do tab, 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 and you will go back 3 elements. And then if you need to go forward, you'll just press tab and so on. So those are kind of the biggest ones that you will most likely be interacting with, because that's how you're going to navigate most of the time. Escape is an important one because this is one that should be working to close maybe a drop down in your menu, or maybe if you were interacting with a modal pop-up window, or maybe even a video or of some sort. So something that's kind of like you interacted with and now it took over the page. If you were to hit escape, it should ideally close that element and bring you back to the original element that opened it. This doesn't always work for everyone, but that is the ideal situation of what you'd be working with. So I'd always try escape first. Arrow keys are going to be very important for things like radios, checkboxes, select elements, and carousels, for example. If you can't seem to interact with it via the tab key, try using the arrow keys, because sometimes I know it can be confusing to some users. So let's say you got to a bunch of options of radio elements. So those are little circle checkboxes where you can only choose one. If you get to that, you can choose tab, but if you choose tab again, it's going to go to the next input, not to the next radio. So when you get to that, you would use the up and down arrow keys and you can select the option that you're looking for. The same thing with drop down selects. When you get there and you open it up, you would use the up and down arrow keys to interact. And with carousels and sliders, you should be able to gain focus on the entire slider and use the left and right arrow key to navigate through those elements. And finally is space or the enter buttons. So for links, they can only use the enter key. For buttons, like actual HTML buttons, they can use the space bar or the enter key. So the good thing is obviously if you're interacting with something, enter is going to work no matter what. That is the ideal situation, but you do need to make sure that buttons work for space bars as well. So let's talk about going into more detail about what we're looking for when we're interacting with a keyboard. So the first question you want to ask yourself is, can you at least interact with your site? If you can't interact with it, obviously update your preferences. If you still can't interact with it after that, then obviously something is a little wrong. So you may have to get someone involved in helping that. You want to ask yourself, is the interaction expected? Are you for a fact that if you hover over a main menu item that a dropdown appears. Hover doesn't exist on mobile and keyboard. So of course, if you're hovering, how are you getting that information? So you're expecting something to happen and it's not happening, or are you interacting with something and something else happened that wasn't supposed to happen and now you're confused? So you just want to think about, is the interaction expected? Were you expecting this to happen when you interacted with it? You need to check your focus styles. So one thing you need to remember when you're tabbing through your site is you need to make sure you know where you are on the site, because of course, someone using a keyboard is most likely a visual person. I will show you what a focus style looks like, but really, as long as you're using the browser defaults, then that should be the most compliant option that you have there. You want to interact with skip links. A lot of times on many websites, the first thing that you get to will actually be a skip to main content link. And that enables the person to skip over the entire main navigation and jump straight back into the content. And you want to make sure, okay, I see that thing. So now I'm going to press enter, and visually you may see the whole page kind of scroll up and now you're in the content. But actually a lot of times I'll press tab again and I'm still up in the header. So clearly visually it changed, but overall it did not change the tab focus. So now the user who's using a keyboard still actually needs to tab through the entire main navigation instead of just jumping straight to the content. You want to make sure you can interact with the modals, pop-ups, and carousels. Can you open up the modals? Can you open up your drop-downs? Can you go through a carousel? Are you stuck? You need to make sure that you can actually interact with everything you're interacting with. You want to pay attention to logical order. And this one is as simple as just, is the cursor going where you're expecting it to go? So are you jumping from the header and now you're in the main menu and you're kind of following that left to right, top to bottom logical order? Or did you just all of a sudden jump to the footer and then back to the header or anything like that? A lot of times I see when someone has a right-hand sidebar, you're jumping to the sidebar first and then going to the content, which can be a little confusing because you're expecting the content first because that's on the left side. You want to make sure you can go forwards and backwards. And I mentioned this before, but hover should not be displaying any more information anymore. Hover should just be those micro interactions that let you know that it's interactive. So for instance, if you have your main menu and you're hovering to display more information, we may have to take a look at how to fix that and to make that more of a click interaction so that we can ensure that keyboard users can interact with it, screen reader users can interact with it, as well as people who are on their mobile devices and tablets, because we don't want to have to do those double clicks to actually have something appear. We want, or like get where we need to go. So if you can just get rid of hover, that's ideal. Another instance where I see this is maybe where people have call to actions, but they're images. And when you hover over the image, more text appears, and then there's a learn more link. But you have to hover in order to get that information and to get going where you need to go. And if you can't interact with it via keyboard or touch because it's on hover, then people aren't able to get where they need to go. And finally, check your mobile menu. I know you're not going to think about this, most people don't, but mobile menu, obviously everything on touch needs to work via keyboard because they're all kind of interconnected in that way. So I like to just check real quick and just make sure I can interact with the mobile menu via keyboard, because then I at least know that if I can interact with it via keyboard, a screen reader user can use it, any assistive tech user can use it, and so on. So here's a quick little video of me using the keyboard. Now there's going to be some things like I can't hit the escape key in this example because of the screencast you're using. If you hit escape, you're getting out of the whole screencast. I will say that Apple will allow that, so I'm not going to go over that piece, but I will walk through everything else that I'm finding. So here you can see I'm back on the Apple site, and I'm going to click just to get into the browser here, and I'm clicking the tab. You can see this is the focus style I am referring to. You can see exactly where you are on the page. This is the browser default. Firefox has a slightly different one. Safari has a slightly different one, but as long as it's the browser default, you're good. So I'm tabbing through, and I knew that search was a pop-up, so I'm going to click and interact with that. You can see I'm here, and now I'm going to use the arrow keys, and I can kind of pick the quick links that I'm looking for, and I can close it as well. So I interacted with that close button, and now I'm in this little slideshow here. Let's see. Oh, no, I forgot about this part. So I didn't even see it. So that is actually a link, but it doesn't look like a link. So that's something I would definitely take notice of. Like, oh, it's a little star, but I don't know what's happening there. You want to make sure it looks interactive if you can interact with it. Then we're making this a little bit smaller so we can check the mobile menu and some other instances here. So you can see this is the slider that I was referring to, and there are these little arrows on the left and right, and I can't get to them, which is confusing. However, I can use the left and right arrow keys to interact to see more. So that works pretty well. And then I can gain focus on the mobile menu icon, and I can navigate through so I can easily get to where I need to go. And you can see there, it's pretty simple. You're just tabbing through and kind of getting to where you need to go, seeing if you can interact with everything. And again, those unexpected interactions, like that little asterisk that I didn't even know was a link, that's something to definitely take note of. So now that we went through the automated testing and we did the keyboard review, now you can review the site by just looking at it. This is where you will confirm any false errors or check for any structural elements and so on. You may use your mouse to check some of these items, of course, and you are going to use your eyes to make a review. This is where you should apply some human logic and flag anything that doesn't seem quite right. So first off, you definitely want to check at various sizes. One of the first guidelines for WCAG is to make sure that your site is responsive. So you want to make sure it works for desktop, it works for mobile, tablet, and all of those in between sizes. You just make your browser smaller and bigger and see what's going on. You can check on your phone, and obviously if it's working there, then you're good there. Another big one is we want to make sure that we're zooming in up to 200%. This is an actual number that you should be shooting for when you are zooming in, because that is based on some WCAG guidelines. There are users out there who require magnification in order to be able to see what's going on the page. So this is what you need to do. You need to make sure that you're not scrolling horizontally at all when you zoom in. You want to make sure that images are still nice and clear when you zoom in. So that's why we like to use SVGs. And we want to stay away from images with text on them, because at that point, if you're zooming in, now the text isn't resizing properly. So you're just going to be seeing it being a little blurry. And another big issue that I see here with the zooming in with 200% a lot is text overlapping with things that they shouldn't be overlapping with. So now it's kind of just difficult to navigate overall. But usually I will say that if your site is responsive, you're most likely going to be okay with the zooming in up to 200%, but it's definitely worth checking out. You want to check for any false contrast errors. Like I said, this is kind of the one we see most often. And this is usually when it's text over images. So you can see here, Wave is calling out Media Matters for America is not working over this image. And that's because the white is just looking at an image, which technically isn't a color. So if you were to use the eyedropper tool, for instance, you can actually do white over the blue overlay and kind of see if that is actually false or not. You want to make sure that color isn't the only means of distinction. So for instance, if you're looking at this graph, you'll have to say, okay, red is, now look at the keys, cats, and okay, dark blue is dogs, green is birds, purple is rabbits, and so on. However, if I was to ask my husband to look at this right now, he is colorblind. He's not going to be able to tell the difference between hamsters and dogs. Honestly, that will be one big color to him. So he would be very confused, and he wouldn't be able to tell what the 15% is related to. So you need to make sure that it's not only dictated by color alone. You need to make sure that there are words that are a part of it, maybe iconography, patterns, and so on. So by including some text that goes over it, it becomes a little bit more clear that 15% is with hamsters, 10% with rabbits, and so on. I also see this a lot with links, and that's a reason why we actually underline links as a default, because if you're just changing it by color, a lot of users may not see that color change and will not know that it is a link. You want to check the target area and make sure it's large enough. According to WCAG guidelines, it needs to be a minimum of 44 pixels by 44 pixels. And that's not like, let's say the hamburger menu, the mobile menu icon over there, like that itself, the icon doesn't need to be 44 by 44, but the entire target touch area needs to be 44 by 44. So that usually includes padding and everything else. But you can see it becomes a lot easier to choose the option if you have that larger touch area, or the click me, which I would never write click me, but for that instance, like you can easily see that that's going to work very well. Within the new WCAG guidelines, which were supposed to launch in April, which have been pushed back now to the fall, they are including a new AA standard so that the minimum will be 24 by 24, but for now it needs to be 44 by 44. You need to make sure that links actually look like links, and anything that is interactive actually looks interactive. You want people to actually interact with it, so it needs to look like it would be. So I mentioned before, this is why we have to include underlines. Underline is the universal sign for links. So that's why we have it there. But if you think about it, if that underline wasn't there and it was just blue text, some people may not see that blue text against that black, so they won't even know that that's a link. So you just need to make sure that you are not doing by color alone and that you are making something actually look interactive. You need to make sure heading and hierarchy is very important. And yes, I know a lot of times the hierarchy is not in the correct order. I'm actually doing a whole webinar on that, I think in July, or I don't know, sometime coming up. I'm sure Jenna will tell you at the very end. But one of the most important things that I will want you to stay away from is to never bold paragraphs to make it look like a heading, because screen reader users can actually navigate the entire page by all the elements that you're using. So like list elements, they can jump from images, they can jump to section headers, they can jump from H1 to H2 to H3 to H4 and look at all the H2s on the page, all the links on the page, and so on. However, bolded paragraphs are not a heading, they're just a paragraph. So they're not going to know to jump to that section and be able to dive in deeper because they can't render that in from a screen reader perspective. So if you're bolding paragraphs to make it look like a heading, do not do that, make it an actual heading. And one thing you need to ask yourself, is there a lot of movement, blinking or flashing? This is something that I don't see as often anymore. I feel like it was definitely that time when parallax was happening everywhere and there's like a lot of movement overall. But I do see this in videos. So that is something you would have to take notice of. But in general, if content flashes more than 3 times per second, it's probably considered unsafe. However, like I said, this most likely isn't relevant to most of you. One thing you need to take a look at is alternative text. Is it meaningful and is it relevant? You need to make sure you keep it short and succinct. You want to convey the content and function of the image within the context of your content, which that is kind of a mouthful and I'm so sorry, but basically you need to make sure like an image has alternative text that makes sense within the context of the page. So like a picture of I'm trying to think of an example. A picture of maybe a football team will make sense on a sign-up page, but now you have to make sure that the alternative text might be changed if it's like a how-to of how to play football. Like those 2 alternative texts may actually be completely different. And you want to stay away from words like image of or logo of, because when a screen reader announces it, they're saying image and then the alternative text. So if they're hearing image of blah, 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 that's just going to be a little redundant. And similar to how we get overwhelmed by looking at all of the text, they might get a little overwhelmed by hearing too much redundant text. And one thing that you will actually get flagged by nowadays is do not fill these with SEO keywords. That's not helpful. That's not the reason for alternative text. And that is why you can get flagged for that nowadays. You need to make sure that links are descriptive enough for users to understand by just the link text alone. So you need to avoid things like learn more, read more, click here. And in instances, sometimes join event is not even descriptive. And what I mean by all these vague links is that I mentioned screen reader users can navigate by all elements on the page. So let's say they're looking at all the links that you have on the page because they're trying to get to the content that they're looking for. If they're hearing learn more, learn more, learn more, learn more, learn more, learn more, they don't know what they're learning more about in all of those instances. So now they have to find one of those learn mores, back up in the screen reader, kind of find the context of what they're learning more about, and then go to see if that's the right one. You should be kind of more descriptive in saying like sign up for blah, 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 or download this file, or join the Aten webinar reviewing your website event, or something of that sort. And things like join event can be descriptive if it's the only one on the page. However, if you're seeing a lot of times, like I see with event listings where there's multiple join event, join event, join event, it's no longer descriptive because there's multiple events to join. And you need to make sure that your links to alternative formats always include a notice. So if you are linking to a PDF, include the PDF like I have here within the link. If you're linking to an Excel document, make sure you have that format listed. Google Slides, make sure it's there. If it's a non-HTML page, warn the user of the type of format that they're going to be dealing with. Okay, so now that we set up the review, we did all the automated testing and the manual testing, what else can you do before you hand it over to some experts? So first, you want to make sure that you get your audio and video files accurately transcribed. There are some great resources out there for video and audio transcription, and therefore we do not actually have a focus on that here at Aten, because there are people who that's their livelihood, that's exactly all that they do, and we want to make sure that you're getting the most efficient version of it. However, this is a major aspect of accessible media. So reminder that automated captions and automated transcripts are the bare minimum, but technically they are not considered accessible as they are not fully accurate. They are better than nothing, but it's up to your organization to ensure that your content gets accurate transcriptions if you have media on your site. So just be sure to reach out to maybe Transcribe Me or rev.com, which are two of the bigger ones that I know out there that we always recommend to anyone looking to have the audio files and media files transcribed. And finally, you will need to add an accessibility statement to your site. This is something anyone can write up. There are plenty of templates out there, and even just some of your favorite websites, and grow some inspiration from there if you see them. Some basic info on what it is and why you should have it is because it's basically the first line of defense. It's usually the first thing lawyers tend to look for when coming to a site for ADA compliance. And accessibility statements are recommended to be found on every site, even if your site is not compliant. The proper information will give the user someone to connect with to voice a concern or get alternative formats to the information that they're looking for, rather than jumping straight to any kind of legal issue. And it should be extremely easy to find and found on every page, so that if someone's coming to your site and they have an issue, they can do a Command F, look for accessibility, jump to that page, get the information they need, and move on. We at Aten like to put it in the footer. It tells the user important information about the quality of your site, as well as important contact information. So obviously, if there's something that's kind of not in the greatest shape for them to interact with, then they'll actually know ahead of time. Or if they would like more information, they can contact you and get that information rather than maybe jumping to someone else that may cause some issues. So for instance, here's the Aten website, and you can see here in the bottom corner, we have an accessibility link, and that takes you to the accessibility statement. This is also a screenshot that includes the bottom half of our accessibility statement, and you can see with the contact information, we include both email and phone. And that's important because some users may not be able to use a phone very well, and some users may not be able to use email very well. So by including both of those, you're accommodating anyone that may be interacting with your site. So what types of things should you include in your accessibility statement? You always want to include the guidelines that your site is following or shooting for. So most likely it's going to be WCAG. If it's 508, 508 actually just points to WCAG in general in the law there. If you're from Ontario, you have other law guidelines that you might be following. Japan, European, anything, like you're going to be following whatever guideline makes the most sense for you. And you want to warn the user of any major issues found on your site. If you know for a fact that something is not accessible, you want to put it in there. If you have an interactive map, you want to make sure that you know that that's not accessible and that you're looking for alternative formats. And better yet, if you know that the interactive map is not accessible to everybody, you definitely want to put a note on that page by the map so that a user will know that they can contact you for an alternative format. You want to include a date or time period when these issues should be resolved. And it doesn't have to be like May 10th, 2023. It can be fall of 2023, fall of 2024, as long as it's something that you're shooting for and that you are actually hitting over and over again. So it could even be in steps as well. You want to list any preferred technology or browsers to navigate the site. Most likely this is not relevant to anyone. This is something I used to see a lot, but now I feel like that's part of it. You need to make sure it works for all browsers and all devices. And you need to include any technology limitations, if any. Again, this is another one I don't see as often anymore, especially now that Internet Explorer is not really there. In the past, JAWS actually worked best with Internet Explorer, but now JAWS actually works best with Chrome and Edge. And so that's just one that we don't have to worry about quite as much anymore. And again, contact information for both the user, as both email and phone. So great. You went through the steps in your automated tools. You did your keyboard testing. You did your manual review. You made the changes where you needed to and reached out to some companies to get your videos transcribed. And you even have an accessibility statement now. You've done everything you can do, but the real question is still there. Am I compliant or not? Well, the next steps is really to get real users to test your site. We want to include real users to test everything. If you notice, there was no point in this whole presentation where I said that you need to learn how to use a screen reader. Screen reader testing involved is important, but I don't usually do it at the first part of the review, and definitely not for everybody that doesn't know how to use one. And that's because only true everyday users who use assistive technology as an extension of themselves should be performing reviews. Experience is absolutely necessary. The way I use a screen reader when I do my testing is completely different than someone who uses it every day. I do it just to make sure bare minimums work, but overall, we need to make sure that we always have real users testing. That's why at Aten, I have mentioned before, but we're partnering with the Blind Institute of Technology. BIT is a nonprofit organization with a mission of placing people with disabilities in the workforce and equalizing the playing field for everyone through technology. We are working together to bring awareness and education to everyone in the digital space. BIT is also helping us perform our user testing for ADA compliance and have been true experts in enhancing our accessibility practices at Aten. I've loved working with them. I also want to note that you should always hold off on all of your user reviews until you know that your site is actually usable to those who require assistive tech. The last thing we want to do is hand over a site and say, hey, can you test this out and give me some feedback? But really, no one can actually interact with it. So you're not going to get the feedback you're looking for. So I always recommend this step after you've implemented all of your changes and can ensure the site at least works via keyboard. And lastly, you need to make sure you reach out to someone who performs accessibility reviews. You need someone well-versed in 508, WCAG, or any other form of ADA compliance to get the best of your site. We've helped with trainings, worked with clients and in-house developers. We've performed overall reviews and so on. More importantly, coming to Aten, you will receive an updated stamp of approval from actual users stating that your site is compliant or usable once everything has been updated. So just remember that Aten is here to help. We believe in giving back to the community, like doing informative webinars like the one I'm doing today, as well as helping with accessibility statements. If that's something that you're looking for, you just want something bare minimum. This is usually the first step I would actually put on every site nowadays, is like you just know something needs to be updated. You know that you may not be fully accessible, but here you at least have this here. You can go to this site. I think Jen is putting these links in the chat for us, so you're more than welcome to jump there, but you will get all these slides later on as well. We also offer free consultations of your website's ADA compliance. So if you are looking for some help, or just maybe this was overwhelming because there's a lot of information thrown at you today, we're here to help. We can walk you through basically what we went over today, but more geared towards your site and just what we think your next steps would end up being. Or if you already know your site needs some help and are in need of an audit, we're obviously here to help with anything that you need. And as mentioned, I'm always doing webinars and blog posts. So we have a bunch here. We'll send over these links afterwards and a bunch of other resources for you. But these are some great webinars that I think are still related to what we talked about today and go into more detail, maybe like the creating accessible content for your website jumps into more detail about heading hierarchy and alternative text and infographics and things like that. They jump into more of that so you can get more information there. And that's basically it. Just remember, if you have any questions that we didn't get to today or would like any follow-ups or even more customized training for your team, feel free to reach out to work@aten.io for anything that you may need.